Greetings. This is another one of our lectures covering communication as it relates to different issues in society. And we're going to talk a little bit about social structures, a little bit about the challenges that are faced when you deal with people across who have different perceptions of social structure. Now, we introduced this idea just a little bit back when we were talking about communicating across differences. We talked about the idea of some people having an achievement concept of how people earn the right to be considered excellent, and then you have the concept of social status being part of birth. That's one form of social structure that we've already discussed. At this point, we're going to talk about social structures in general, and we're going to talk about it more related to the issue of communication. Now, we've looked at this a couple of times before. You guys are probably starting to have it memorized. It's very possible I may have you be able to explain it on an exam before the end of this class, so you do want to be aware of this. But once again, we're talking about communication, and everything, and then you've already went through it in several lectures, but everything that goes on, that red line with the squiggle over it, that's noise. The concept of social status and such, that is noise. That's something that makes communication more challenging. It's something that we have to account for as cross-cultural communicators. We have to learn about other people's understanding of social status and learn how to communicate based on their understanding of social status. So we're going to look at social structures just for a couple of minutes here. Because people don't act according to societal norms, but also according to their perceived status and role in society. All societies have norms. All societies have ways of expected behavior. However, in most societies, there are different levels of norms based on the status of a person. There are different ways that expected behaviors that people might have based on what they are, where they fit in society. For instance, if you are a person who is a poor person in certain societies, it is expected that you will be asking for help from the rich, and it's perfectly acceptable for you to beg or ask or things like that, because that's one of the things that you will do. If you are a very high authority person, a very high person in a society, it might be considered perfectly normal for you to have a wife and maybe 2 or 3 lovers on the side. I remember talking to someone about from France, and they talked about the fact that they were discussing their current prime minister and who his consorts were at the moment. And I'm just saying, in the States, that's a pretty big deal when one of our politicians is found to be having an affair. Well, in France, if you're a person of high position, it's just expected, Of course, he has a wife, he has this lover here, he has that lover there. It's a norm, but the norm is based on the role in society that people have. Now, once again, like I've talked about in other lectures, just because it's norm in the society doesn't mean we have to accept it. There are kingdom principles that override those norms, and as long as we're preaching from the Word of God and preaching from kingdom principles, we have to address those even if they are not part of our society. But their norms a lot of times are based on their status. And these social structures, we'll talk about this. This is going to be a slide a little later in this lecture. They influence both the flow of communication and the significance of communication. And remember those 2 words. The social structures influence the flow of communication, how much communication takes place, and they influence the significance of that communication, how much that communication means to people. So we'll be talking about that in a graphic coming up a little later in the presentation. We, as missionary or cross-cultural communicators, must be aware of our own role in society. And we need to be aware of the status and role of the hearers that we are talking to. This concept of social structures and social status has a profound impact on communication, and we need to be aware of it. in many places, if you come in as an outsider, if you come in as an American, a citizen of the United States especially, you are automatically in the top 5% of that nation's rich. The poorest person, okay, yeah, okay. A person who is considered to be below the poverty level in America is still in the top 5% of the world's population in their wealth and in the things that they have that are accessible to them. We have to understand that when we go in, we're going to have to be very careful about our communication because we are considered to be a people of high status, whether we consider ourselves people of high status or not. And so that's going to be a thing we need to be aware of in our communication. So we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. Just want to talk for a few minutes about the issue of how names often are a reflection of how social status works in a society. In the U.S. and in other Western countries, we tend to have our names be very, very individualized. When we introduce ourselves to someone, we would... matter of fact, it's been kind of interesting to me since I've come back to the States this time. I was gone for 15 years. That introductions have even become more individualized and less formal. There was a time, even 20 years ago, when you would introduce yourself with your full name. Or you'd introduce yourself, if you were the older person, you'd introduce yourself as Mr. Roberts or as Mrs. Roberts or something like that. But it's become even more common just to, hey, I'm Dave, I'm Kevin, I'm Mike. And this idea of just throwing out your first name makes you, hey, I'm the individual. I tend to, when someone introduces themselves to me, I ask them, and what's your last name? Because I want to know if I happen to know your father, or happen to know your uncle, or happen to know your mom or your cousin or whatever else. I want to know if I know you through some other way. But anyway, you can just I'm wandering off the subject a bit, but you can see what I'm talking about because that my son is named is Kevin Scott Roberts. His name is Kevin Scott Roberts because we liked the name Kevin and we liked the name Scott. Neither of those two names appeared in our family before. It was his individual name given to him. My wife, if you look her up on Facebook, is Terry Fry Roberts. Now that's because we're a patrilineal society. Fry was her name when she was born. She was born into the family that was called Fry. When we married, because we were typically a patrilineal society, typically the woman in the marriage relationship takes the man's last name. Now, there have been some movements in the U.S. where sometimes women are keeping their own last names or doing the hyphenated last names and stuff like that. That's not like breaking the law or breaking the law of God or whatever else. It's just different from what our society typically does. Now, my name is Jerry W. Roberts, Jr. Well, I've got Jr. because my dad was Jerry W. Roberts. So that designates that Jr. shows that that's who I am. Now, I'm still the Jr. is to differentiate me from my father, but at the same time, it's an evidence that I was named after my father. But all of these are individualized names. Now, the Hispanic names are interesting because they're both individual and they reflect the familial nature of society. If you know Dora Alicia Martinez de Gomez, that person is probably the series of names they have is going to be their grandmother's name and then their favorite, the mother's favorite aunt's name, and then the mother's maiden name followed by the father's name, or vice versa, depending on where you're at. So, once again, still very individual because the name is very specific to that person only, but it also reflects family identity because it ties you to other parts of the family. There are some names that have flowed out of the idea of occupational identity. You know, obviously shoemaker is one. Wright, most people don't realize that a wheelwright is a person who made wheels back in the old days. Cook, of course, would have been a cook. Tailor was a person who made clothes. We don't realize what our names mean anymore because we think of them as names and don't think about what they originally meant. Maybe David, who was the cook, became David Cook. So anyway, but these are all individualized names. Now, you want to talk about true individualism, you'll have to go, the place to find the ultimate individualism in names is in Iceland. Because if you have a man named John Stephenson and he has a son named Fjalar, Fjalar's name will not be Stephenson like his father's, it will be John's son. So his name will be Fjalar Johnson, meaning the son of John. All right? So, if you have the same practice for females, John Stephenson's daughter is not going to have the name Stephenson. She's going to be John's daughter. So, her name would be Kata, John's daughter. So, anyway, you can look at this and you can see if you're a four-person family, and this is I can only imagine what it's like dealing with their paperwork. But a four-person family, there's going to be four different last names. The married couple is John Stephenson, because his father's name was Stephen. Bryndis Alta daughter, because it was the daughter of Alta. Their children, Fjalar Johnson and Kata John's daughter. That is pretty specific. But once again, it's specific, it's very personal, but it also clearly ties you to your role in the family. What family you flowed out of, who your father was, is what it determines. So anyway, these are just examples to show you how different people do it. Now, you go into the East, many times you have group identification shown in the names. Of the Eastern countries, you have social identification. Takshimaya Noa. Once again, Noa in Latvian means from, and I've got a feeling that no also means that in that, but Noa Motoyama Hiroshi, and this is Hiroshi Matayama, who belongs to Shaka. Anyway, I can't say all of those because I don't speak any of the Eastern languages, but you can see that sometimes they have this long old name, but the truth is that the name tells you not just who they are, but what group they are a part of. And so you can, once again, it shows social status and social structure. So these are not just there to show you all the different, because every part of the world has names and they have different purposes for their names. This is just to show you that social structure is often reflected in different ways. While we are considering social structure, we have to consider how these social structures affect people's understanding of communication. Some societies are more open to communication between social strata. Real quick, we'll look at this real quick, stop the video, type down a few notes. How did the U.S. culture view communication between social strata? All right, I'm assuming you did that. You wrote down a few notes. The truth is the U.S., it tends to be very open in our communication between social strata. We tend to be people who... I could walk up and talk to the bank president, and a small child can walk up and talk to me without asking permission. We're very open to this kind of idea. There are some countries that you would not dare assume that you, as a normal, especially as a student, would never consider walking up and talking to the president of the college. That's just not done. You may speak to your instructor, and your instructor might set up a meeting for you with the assistant to the president. And after you talk to the assistant to the president, you might get the opportunity to visit with the president after that. But you're certainly not going to walk up and talk to the president of the college. But here I see students do it all the time. Presidents walking across campus, they might stop and have a quick conversation with the president of the college. So the U.S. tends to be more open to this concept. When a person changes cultural context, their social position often changes. And I've already mentioned that when it relates to missionaries. Missionary or intercultural workers, your social status, you may consider yourself to be kind of a lowly person in the United States. You may consider yourself to be kind of a person who is more on the down and out side. You didn't come from a big rich family. You go to some parts of the world, you are the richest person in the room. Even if you were the poorest person in the room in the States, you became the richest person in the room, and you've got to be aware of that. And oftentimes it's education that is significant. Not everywhere, but many places, as you get better education, you actually can move in and out of classes based on what level your education is. So these are just different things we need to be considering. You may have started out as a person from a poor family, a person who did not have a lot of influence and such. Well, you move up through the role, and one day you get your doctorate in philosophy, and all of a sudden people are inviting you, this kid who came from the wrong side of the track, so to speak, all of a sudden you're being invited to speak at conferences because you've educated and your education has moved you to a different social status and social structure. Well, I'm going to stop there for the moment, let you have a little break, and then pick up right there talking about the issue of social status.